Okay, well, good evening, everyone. The restrooms are back past the foyer. The men and women's right there across from each other. They've got to get that out of the way. I think we'll probably have a few people coming in late, so this is just a rough time with traffic, so bear with people kind of coming in, but we want to try to stay on schedule here. So let's welcome our panelist members. Kelly Fessler, North Harris County Regional Water Authority District 5 Board Member. John Ellis, Gulf Coast Studies Chief, USGS Oklahoma Texas Science Center, Houston, and Mike Turco, the GM for Harris Galveston Subsidence District. Our sponsors, AWBD, Water User Coalition, a couple of our main members, Timberlane Utility District. What a great facility this is. Big thank you to them. Bud Gessel, Bob Shank, Dan Meacham. Thank y'all very much. We really appreciate it. And then Harris County Freshwater Supply District 61. My name is Jerry Holman, and I am an AWBD trustee, also a government affairs chairman for AWBD. I'm also the general manager for Harris County Freshwater Supply District 61 and the co-chairman of the Water User Coalition. I'll be moderating and facilitating this panel discussion, North Harris County Regional Subsidence Update. We're so glad you joined us. Please silence your phones while you're in the meeting and exit the room before taking any calls. If you must exit the room for any reason, please do so in a quiet manner. Our panelists will also be taking questions at the end of the presentation. See agenda. Please be respectful of others, maintain civility and common courtesy throughout our program. The program is being recorded and will be available on the AWBD website library in its entirety. Thank you to the Harris County Commissioner, Tom Ramsey. Several of his staff members are here today, so if you'd like to visit with them, please do. Please raise your hand if you are an elected official. Please keep your hand up if you are a member or supporter or receive information from the Water User Coalition. Very good. Just kind of wanted to get a feel for who's here. Most of you are elected officials. Our first speaker, Kelly Fessler. Kelly and his wife, Marcy, have lived in Spring for over 30 years. Their 4 children and 5 grandchildren all still live here in Harris County. Kelly holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in chemistry from Oral Roberts University. Following an early career as a refinery chemist, Kelly branched out into the area of software development and related consulting. His now 38-year career in the software industry has provided him with a broad experience in such diverse areas as automated petrochemical distribution, process analysis, configuration management, and regulatory compliance. Kelly is the founding president of the Cherry Tree Republican Club, a community activist organization formed in the early 1990s for Republican voters in the North Harris County. He has represented our community as an elected delegate to many Republican senatorial districts and state conventions. Kelly is dedicated to staying the course and implementing the best solutions for ensuring a long-term water supply for our area and keeping water rates as low as possible for as long as possible. Kelly Fessler.
Thank you very much. My presentation is about 15 minutes. I have some slides to update you on the progress that the Water Authority has made towards our surface water conversion targets. And then we'll discuss a little policy towards the end of my portion here. So the slide that you see is currently, this is District 5, as was recently redrawn in 2022. So if you're in those boundaries, then I am your elected representative to the Water Authority. So I wanted to update you on our current rates. So when the new board came on board, they were asking some pretty good questions. And one of them was, did we have money that we had maybe over-collected? And our financial advisor indicated that, yes, there was. And so the new majority on the board wanted to come in, and they had kind of promised a rate reduction. So we dropped our water rates by 50 cents per thousand back in January. So for the average homeowner, that's about, I'm guessing, about $10 a month. So may not be a lot, but it was something. If you notice on the right-hand side, our disincentive fee for not hitting the Subsidence District mandated targets is $10.78 per thousand. I've been trying to, in my 21 years on the board, I've been trying to avoid that at all costs. Because not only is it the disincentive fee, we'd also, that would have to be passed on to water users in addition to the water rates that are shown on the left-hand side, because it's a penalty. So it's something we want to try to avoid, and I've been trying to do that. So what does the Water Authority fee pay for today? Okay, that's not what I was expecting on that slide. Oh, here we go. It's a transition, sorry. Okay, so permit fees, which we pay to the Subsidence District, which in the grand scheme of things are not huge, but it helps pay for the administration of their monitoring us for compliance. A lot of our expense goes to pay for treated water from the city of Houston. So we own currently 31 million gallons a day of capacity from the Northeast Treatment Plant. And there is a cost associated with that. We, back 20 years ago, negotiated buying water from the city, owning capacity in that plant, and getting our water at cost. And yes, do we need to keep an eye on the city to make sure that what they're charging us is only cost? Yes, we do. But that's the agreement. So in order to build out the infrastructure that we've had to build to move the water from the Northeast plant, which is over on Lake Houston, we've had to build quite a bit of pipe. If you've driven down the Beltway and you've seen that big 9-foot diameter pipe, 8-foot diameter pipe, that's what our bond debt service is paying for. And there's pipe going in all over the North Harris County area. We're also paying for a water transfer project that pulls water from the Trinity River, and it brings it down partway through Loose Bayou, but we got to get it to Loose Bayou first. And it was the one thing where I thought the city really made a great move years ago, which is it's an exemption from the interbasin water transfer law that basically says you can't move water from one river basin to another, but they got an exemption. So that allows us to pull water from the Trinity and bring it into Lake Houston so that we still have plenty of water if the San Jacinto and other tributaries dry up or reduce their water output. So that's one of the big projects. again, this is the transmission lines and the pump stations that we are having to build. We have one on Spears, just off of Spears Road. That's our currently biggest operational one. There's a brand new one that's being built over near 249 in the Beltway. That's the Rendell Regional Water Pump Station, and that's named in honor of our former past president, Mr. Al Rendell. And then we have to build distribution lines to the mud. So from these pump stations and different spots in the system, we actually have to finally get the water to the muds. So that's what a lot of the cost is. We also have operational costs. So we run an office with a very small staff. I think our staff count is around 12, if that many. So we did not want to ramp up a big, large governmental organization that once we're done with all the construction and the heavy lifting, now we've got this bureaucracy to deal with. So we wanted to kind of keep it lean and mean, outsource to private industry when we can, so that we're not on the hook for years to come. Okay, so this is a map of the Loose Bayou project. So you can see where we tap off of the Trinity River up in the upper right, and then it goes all the way down and dumps into Loose Bayou in the lower left. And then Loose Bayou continues to go and drop into Lake Houston. That was a good chunk of change. But we partnered with other entities, and I'll show you that here in a second. So here are the other facilities that are being built, and my apologies for, these are a little older than I'd wanted, but it's what I had at the time. So we had the Northeast Water Purification Plant over just off of Lake Houston. Then next to it is the intake for the Trinity River Loose Bayou project. So that's where we pull the water in from the Trinity. And then how we get the water out of Lake Houston is that bottom slide there. That's the intake station. Here's the Northeast transmission line. That's the big pipe that goes along the Beltway. There's just a shot of how big that pipe is and how far down we have to go to lay it. And here's a line for some of our partners that we actually share capacity with, that we deal with for legislative purposes. So we have partnerships all around the area. So that's City of Houston, North Fort Bend Water Authority, Central Harris County Water Authority, and the West Harris County Water Authority. One that we're doing on our own is the Rendell Regional Pump Station. So this is a very early photo of that pump station under construction. And then this photo here is the planned final version, what it's going to look like. So lots of ground storage tanks to supply the next round of surface water. That target is for 2025. So I did want to talk I probably went a little bit long. I'm going to try to shorten this up.
You're good, Kel.
We sent, the board voted to send a letter to the Subsidence District asking for these 5 different items here. If you look at the record, I voted no. I didn't think we were ready for some of these items. So they wanted to push back the 2025 and 2035 targets for another 10 years. In my opinion, we didn't have the data to back that up, and I didn't want to sound like we were just kind of willy-nilly picking, 10 more years. The Subsidence District already pushed out the 2020 date to 2025 back in 2013. So they realized that there were, that it could be slowed down and the subsidence would not be negatively affected. So there's no reason to think that they wouldn't do that again, in my opinion. They wanted to change the 2025 and 2035 percentage targets. So those are currently 60 and 80%. The 2025 target, I believe that we're 80, 85% there as far as being done with construction. And so I didn't see any need to move that. And then who knows what's going to happen in 2035. We don't have the numbers. Number 3 was to adopt rules to permit the water authority to have autonomy. The new board has been in place. The new majority of the board has been in place for a total of 6 months. And in my opinion, the new board is not ready to have autonomy in such a large operation. And that's one of the reasons I didn't care for this role either. What do we do? I mean, we've seen the Lone Star Conservation District up in Montgomery County. Their compliance entity, they were a compliance entity, so they were supposed to be in charge of converting to surface water. And then the legislature changed them to be an elected board, and they stopped moving forward. And I'm not going to make public a comment that I heard, but I'd be able to share that with you privately. But there was, it's an interesting relationship between us, and I think the Subsidence District and the Lone Star Conservation District. And I just don't think, I don't think we're ready for number 3. Number 4, they wanted to allow the water authority to target the areas that had the worst subsidence and not basically convert the entire water authority to, it seemed confusing to me how they were going to implement a target based on regional things within the water authority. And I think that was kind of in line with number 3. If number 3 passed, that number 4, if we got number 3, that number 4 would kind of go along with that. They also wanted, number 5, to adopt a rule to use the current and any future disincentive fees to help build infrastructure. In my opinion, I can't speak for the water authority, but that disincentive fee is meant to be a penalty. It's to keep us on target, to move towards these conversion numbers and percentages. And if we get to keep that money, then it seems to me like it's less of a penalty. And yeah, we might take an initial hit, but hey, we get that money, we get to keep the money anyway. I don't see that as being conducive to incentivization, or that's the word I used wrong. But anyway, I kind of wanted to go over that with you, explain my positions, and that's really all I have to say tonight publicly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. Our next speaker, John Ellis, is a licensed professional geoscientist and supervisory hydrologist at the USGS Oklahoma Texas Water Science Center in Houston, where he leads a team investigating water quality, land subsidence, and groundwater level changes in the Houston area and northern Texas Gulf Coast. Prior to beginning his position in Houston, John worked as a hydrologist leading aquifer study and developing groundwater models focused on integrating surface water and groundwater resources and evaluating the impacts of climate variability on aquifers and reservoir storage in Oklahoma. John holds a BS degree in geoscience from the University of Texas at Dallas, and a master's degree in environmental science from Simmons University, and a master's degree in hydrology from the University of Alabama. Please welcome John Ellis.
Well, good evening, everybody. I just wanted to talk to you tonight about the thing you've heard a lot about recently, or maybe over the last couple of years, which is land subsidence. So, you know, to start off with, I'm sure you've seen some of the news articles lately. There have been 4 of them this year so far. There have been in total at least 20 over the last 5 years. So you may be asking yourselves, what is this? What is subsidence? How does it work? What are the mechanics? Where is it happening? And that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. Okay. All right, so before I get into the subsidence discussion, I wanted to talk a little bit about the aquifer system. I know some of you in here are probably very familiar with it. Others of you may be less so. So I don't have a ton of time to talk about it tonight, but I just want to talk about the basics. So the slide you see here on the screen, this shows you the Gulf Coast aquifer system, and that's the aquifer system that you have underneath your feet here. Not only in northern Harris County, but also through, as it sounds on the name, the entire Gulf Coast of Texas. So the Gulf Coast aquifer system is made up of 3 primary aquifers. You can see there on the diagram: the Chico aquifer, the Evangeline aquifer, which is below the Chico aquifer, and the Jasper aquifer, which is the deepest of these 3 aquifers. Now, for reference, if you look at, how far down into the earth are these, the Chico aquifer is at land surface down to a depth of about 750 feet below land surface. And the Evangeline is from about 750 feet to about 1,200 feet. The Jasper is from about 1,450 feet to almost 3,000 feet. So the farther down you get into these aquifers, as you can see, they get pretty thick. There's a large amount of saturated area for water withdrawal. So as you see there on the slide, these aquifer units, they aren't horizontal. They do have a dip, starting from the far northern outcrop all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So the groundwater enters the aquifers where they're exposed at land surface, typically in Montgomery County, and they get thicker and thicker as they proceed towards the coastline. So the precipitation that infiltrates these aquifers there in the outcrop area, which is where you see the aquifer at land surface, that becomes recharge when it arrives at the water table. So that's kind of how water enters the aquifer. And then water leaves the aquifer system typically through groundwater wells. And when I say that, I'm talking about the deeper part of the aquifer. I mean, there is quite a bit of recharge that comes into the aquifer system, is in a small area and gets discharged to the rivers and streams around here. You see them flowing, right? That water, typically a lot of that water comes from the aquifer system. But this kind of gives you a conceptual idea of what it is that you're seeing underneath your feet here. So just talk about aquifer storage for a second. So the water stored in the aquifer, it's a balance between the inflows, that recharge that's coming in, and the outflows that's going out generally through groundwater extraction. So almost all that water is from recharge, so that is the dominant control on how much water enters the aquifer system. So when you look at the inflow side, the rate of recharge of the aquifer system, it's very slow. I don't know if you've ever heard or seen the numbers before, read about them, but essentially there's about 4 inches per year of precipitation that falls on the surface of the aquifer system. However, of that 4 inches, only about half an inch enters the Chico aquifer, which is that top aquifer. Only about 0.2 inches enters the Evangeline, and only about 0.1 inch per year enters the Jasper aquifer. So if you think about those are very small numbers. And the reason that is because you have a lot of silt and clay in this aquifer, which impedes the downward flow of all of that water down through the different aquifer layers. Another thing to note also is that, that water, as you saw on the previous slide, I'll pull this back up, it has to travel from where it is recharged all the way down going southward towards the coast to the areas where it is extracted in terms of a groundwater pump. So that water takes quite a bit of time to arrive at those areas basically where you need it. So just to give some rough numbers based on isotope tests, it takes about 5,300 years for water that recharges the Evangeline Aquifer to arrive at the area below your feet here. 5,300 years. It takes about 30,000 years for that same water to arrive at the Jasper Aquifer, that more deeply buried aquifer. So you can take those into account, whereas for the Chico Aquifer, it typically takes less than 50 years. So on the outflow side, as you can see here on the slide, groundwater wells screen these different aquifer units. The tan are wells that screen the Chico Aquifer. The blue is the Evangeline, the darker blue is the Burkeville, the Jasper is the green, and then the Catahoula is the dark red. So again, this is the balance between what's coming in and what's going out. So historically, Houston has had a peak of about 800 million gallons per day of groundwater use all the way back in 1974, many years ago. And that figure right now is about 430 million gallons per day due to the various conversions through the years over to surface water and alternative water supplies. So if you think about that, you have that 0.1, 0.2, 0.5 inch of water recharging the aquifer combined with this today 430 million gallons per day of groundwater withdrawal. So it creates an imbalance between what is coming in and what is going out. So when that happens, you lose aquifer storage and the groundwater levels decline. So this slide shows the groundwater levels in the Evangeline, the Jasper aquifers up in this area, and then in central Harris County, it shows the groundwater levels in the Chico and the Evangeline aquifer. And I show these aquifers because up here in this area, the Chico is not typically a large source of water where the Evangeline Jasper is. In central Harris County, typically the Chico and the Evangeline are your two aquifers that are essentially where you get the bulk of your production. There aren't really any Jasper wells screened that deeply because you'd be looking at 3,000 plus feet to pull up water out of the Jasper all the way down there, if not more. So looking at those water levels, I mean, you see some variation in the groundwater levels over the last 10 years, and this covers 2010 to present. And that's based on hydrologic conditions, droughts, extra precipitation and whatnot. But if you look at those numbers on the y-axis, I mean, those are not near land surface. You're looking at groundwater levels typically 250 to almost 420 feet below land surface. So you can probably guess it was not always that way. If you look at the historical perspective, it looks very different. The slide goes all the way back to 1925. The good news is this area is blessed with an abundance of groundwater level data. USGS started measuring these wells as early as 1928 with some scattered measurements before them. So some of these wells, you have a record of over 100 years of groundwater data measured from the same well year after year after year. So this data is invaluable determining and looking at what's happening with this aquifer system. What is the health through time of this unit? So if you look at, for instance, northern Harris County, you see the Evangeline Aquifer, you see the water level, you see that little line where it shows land surface, you see that it was above it. That means you have a flowing well. So back in the day, many of these wells used to flow. They've been noted in literature, late 1800s, early 1900s, they were virtually everywhere. You had wells that flowed because, again, the potentiometric surface was over land surface. Nowadays, you really do not see much of this anymore in this area. So if you look at those trends in northern Harris County compared to central Harris County, another thing you notice is that the declines in northern Harris County happened later in time than in central Harris County. And that's, of course, because the population of Houston started in the downtown area and it slowly spread northward, northwestward, and westward. And as it spread, the groundwater use obviously was needed. People move to an area, they need a supply of water. So that's essentially what's happened is the groundwater level declines have migrated also with the population north, northwest, and west of the downtown area. So you see the historical minimums in central Harris County in the 70s and 80s versus up here, you see them around 2010. You see the same thing in Montgomery County as well. Now, more recently, you see they started to decline again, and part of that is due to the drought we've had over this last year. It was a pretty exceptional drought we saw declines when USGS measured wells around here as much as 60 feet year over year in one well. So that, the climb and the precipitation does have an impact because most of that decline was due to the increase in use necessary. People do have to have water, and if you can't use the surface water supply, you need groundwater. Okay, so let's talk about land subsidence for a little bit here. So first, on the right side of the screen, I've included a screenshot of some of those news articles I told you about just earlier. All the ones here are all from January onward this year. So there have been 4 of them, and there's a few also that are possibly in the works. So again, this is obviously a topic that comes up, but it's important, it's a timely topic for many people, especially up here in this area. So as a basic definition, subsidence is the lowering of land surface due to compaction in the aquifer. It's basically that easy. Compaction is the process underground. Subsidence is what you see at land surface. Okay? So land subsides as a result of groundwater withdrawals in susceptible aquifer systems like the Gulf Coast aquifer system. And it's generally, you see this in aquifer systems that have significant groundwater level declines, and then also the presence of large amounts of silt and clay, fine-grained materials in the aquifer system. So I mentioned earlier that groundwater levels, they decline, but that alone does not lead to subsidence happening. You have to have that fine-grained material in the aquifer system. Otherwise, you would see subsidence everywhere, and you don't necessarily see that all across the U.S. So it has to be a combination of fairly sizable groundwater level declines combined with this fine-grained material. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the subsidence mechanics here for a second. So if you look at the pore structure of the Gulf Coast aquifer system, all the sediment below your feet here in the aquifer, the sediment is basically the pore structure supported by the granular skeleton of the aquifer system. And the water, the pore fluid pressure that is in the groundwater, that fills the pore spaces of that sediment underneath your feet. So when groundwater levels decline due to pumping, this results in a reduction in that pore fluid pressure that then increases the stress on the skeleton of the aquifer. Okay? So as a result of that increased stress on the skeleton of the aquifer, the silt and the clay sediment in the aquifer compact. And you can see that on the right side of the screen, the before and the after. You see the sand grains, or the clay clay sediment here, it's arranged in every single direction. Then, when groundwater levels decline and you have that increase in effective stress, all those clay layers, they squish together. Okay? So the compaction occurs 99+% of it in the clays, in the fine-grained units, not in the sand. Okay? So those silt and clay layers, they dewater more slowly compared to the sand layers. And again, as I mentioned, those groundwater levels have declined year after year in many areas. So the water level drops in the sand all around that silt and that clay. Then the water in the silt and clay gets squeezed out. And then once the silt and clay gets rearranged and compacted, that loss of porosity and loss of pore space is generally around this area permanent. So I have a diagram of this, kind of shows you the mechanics of what this looks like, and it works well. Thanks, Mike. I stole your diagram. This a lot better than anything I could do. So more or less, this shows you exactly what I just mentioned. You have the compacting of the silt and the clay. They bunch together, squeezes out the water, and the land subsides. Okay, so let's talk about the measuring techniques, because the next question you have is, well, how do you measure it, right? I mean, surely you know how much there's been and how is that? So I'm going to go over 3 of the main measurement techniques and briefly try to mention the 4th one. So the first one is benchmarks. I hope that some of you, maybe in your travels, been to national parks and whatnot, you have seen these little discs you see here on the right side of the screen. Those are called benchmarks, and those were monumented over the last 120 years by the National Geodetic Survey and the U.S. Geological Survey. For USGS, this is part of where we got our start, was monumenting benchmarks, national parks along roadways, canals, infrastructure. So what you do is you monument that benchmark, and below these benchmarks, you have a long rod that goes down into the ground, 5, 10, 15, 20, as much as 30 feet to keep it stable. So that way if something hits it, it won't necessarily be dislodged. So this technique of spirit leveling is where you monument that benchmark, and you survey in an elevation by basically starting, back in the day at the Galveston Pier and running a line all the way up to your benchmark. And from there, you determine that initial elevation. You then come back year after year and you survey it using a spirit level over and over again, the exact same benchmarks. And from there, you can look at how much is the land surface changing. And spirit leveling performed by either USGS or NGS is typically very accurate. You can get accuracy of 0.02, 03 feet on these measurements generally. So this is not something where you have a large amount of uncertainty. This is highly accurate. And we're talking 100 years ago, before you had the advent of computers, it was this accurate. So on the screen on the bottom here, I talked about those benchmarks. That's a benchmark V305. It's in Galveston, and the one to the right of it is a USGS benchmark that's over in the Katy area, and those are still there today. So again, this is this slide. This shows you the network of the earliest benchmarks. This is not all of them. This is only the earliest ones from the teens, 20s, and 30s. There are 2,500 of these around the greater Houston area. This is just the early ones. Okay, second way you measure subsidence is through a borehole extensometer. Don't let the name scare you. This is actually the easiest way to figure out how subsidence works. So if you have subsidence, you know it occurs from, say, 700 feet below the Earth's surface to about 1,000. You drill a hole to about 12 or 1,300 feet below the land surface. You stick a large rod down in it. If you left it right there and just put a little mark at the end of the rod, you could actually see where the land is subsiding. Now we go a step further than that, and we attach a little steel tape over it and run it over what looks for all the world like a seismograph. It's called an F recorder, and it draws a trace on the line, on that graph paper. And you get that trace, that little printout, and as the subsidence happens, that wheel moves at the top of that unit. That tape, as subsidence happens, it turns the tape turns the wheel turns the needle. Okay, so it looks very much like a seismograph, and we have 14 of these at 12 sites in the greater Houston area. And these have been very helpful to determine where is the subsidence happening inside the earth. Benchmarks will get you the total amount. This will get you the compaction inside the earth. The black dots here show you inside the aquifer unit how far down, how deeply these extensometers are anchored. Some of them are very deep, 2,800 and 3,000 feet below land surface. It's a really long steel rod at the Pasadena and Clear Lake Deep extensometers. So these were all installed first beginning in 1959. And going all the way to 1980, and then the Fort Bend one was installed in 2017 to 2018. So that's the second measurement technique. The third one is GPS. So the GPS network around here has largely superseded the benchmark network because, for one, running a leveling survey, if you want NGS to go do that and level 1,500, 2,000 benchmarks, you're talking many millions of dollars. Because they have to send a survey team out there in the field day after day to do this, month after month. An entire network area like this typically took 1.5 years to do. Now you have modern technology, hooray. So you have GPS network, and this slide shows you about 178 GPS stations, although this is not all of them. This is just stations with 5 or more years of data that you see here on the slide. So the GPS stations use orbiting satellites to accurately determine the station's position on the ground. It creates a time series record of changes in land surface. And then the GPS data from these sites is compared to a stable regional reference frame designated as Houston 20. It uses 25 sites outside of the greater Houston area. They have a long history, and we know that they are stable. So that's the third way. Okay, you can also simulate subsidence, and this is done for regulatory purposes. The Texas Water Development Board runs the groundwater availability modeling program. That's part of how you determine the desired future conditions, the model available groundwaters. This has been done for about 20 years now, and this is the most current version, slated to soon hopefully be adopted as the GAM for this area, the Gulf Coast Land Subsidence and Groundwater Flow Model, i.e. the Gulf model. So I won't get into too much into the model, but it basically, you discretize the hydrogeologic units into a number of layers, and you specify inputs and outputs, and you run it into the future to determine what is water levels, what does subsidence look like 20, 30, 50, 80 years into the future. Okay, I'll just briefly talk about historical impacts of subsidence. Just wanted to highlight one of the more well-known examples. I'm sure some of you in here have heard of the Brownwood subdivision. It became nationally known for essentially sinking into the sea, because that's more or less what happened. It gained national attention beginning in 1961 after a hurricane hit the area, and then all the way through the 60s and 70s flooded a number of times, but it wasn't just because of the hurricanes. It's also because the land was sinking at a very rapid rate. So a lot of the media attention on Brownwood happened in the 1970s, just news article after news article, but the story on the neighborhood, it begins much sooner than that. It actually begins around 1918, very early in time. So I've only got 2 slides on this, but just wanted to show these. So this photo shows Brownwood in 1944. This is a Landsat photo from our USGS Aeros archive. And it shows you that neighborhood back when only about a third of it had been built. So remember this number. The average land surface was about 10 feet above sea level across the neighborhood. Now fast forward to 1978. This is what Brownwood looked like. Exact same vantage point, and I've colored in the area in blue that sunk into the sea. The average land surface that was 10 feet above sea level in 1944, in 1978 was now 2.6 feet above sea level. And just to put that number in perspective, a large freighter generates a wake many times that, or so I'm told. The internet said that. I don't know if it's true, but the point is 2.6 feet is basically right at sea level. I'm going to show you a little graph of exactly what happened to that neighborhood. And I don't have much more time to talk this, but I just wanted to point out that graph you see there on the bottom of the screen shows you the land surface elevation in 1944. And then all the way at the bottom, you see it again in 1978. This is the time series of subsidence and water level decline in that neighborhood. As you can see, the water level decline, subsidence, it very much parallels each other. Okay. Moving on from that, I would also note that, there have been many articles written about that, and this is also described in the Gulf Report as well, and I give about a 45-minute presentation on it, but I don't have time for any of that tonight, unfortunately. So I want to talk about getting back to this area, to Houston, to the Houston subsidence. Question is, how much has happened across Houston and northern Harris County, right? At the end of the day, that's what we care about. So let's have a look at that. This is a map of the subsidence across the entire greater Houston area from 1906 to 2021. And those numbers you see there on the slide, those are in feet. If you look over here where we're at, you see between 2 and 5 feet of subsidence. Right here, right below our feet, you're looking at right about 4.5 feet. So look below you, measure about 4.5 feet. Maybe this is 4.5, I don't know. That's where the land was 100 years ago. And it's hard to believe, right? When you look at that, how could that happen? But we know this happened because of those leveling measurements using spirit leveling. We know that this is the case. So looking at the map, the early areas of subsidence were in the southeastern part of the county. Baytown, where Brownwood was at. Pasadena, the downtown area. But over the last 20 years, the subsidence has migrated north, northwest, and westward as the population has expanded in these areas. Again, population expands, you need water. So that's essentially what has happened. You've had increased groundwater use up in these areas. That groundwater use has caused groundwater level declines, and the presence of silt and clay has caused compaction. Okay, so if you want to actually know in our area, looking at that benchmark, looking at those benchmarks and the re-leveling, how much are you getting? Part of that in those numbers I was telling you, part of what created this map is the leveling measurements. So I'm only going to show you 2 of them for the sake of time, but there are many more than this. So this first benchmark right here, it's about 2 miles south of FM 1960, right along I-45 there today. It was installed in 1943. It's been resurveyed 8 times between 1951 and 1996. And that's what these circles are. You see right there, the dashed line is just an interpolation between each of those surveys. So there's been about 5.2 feet of subsidence at this benchmark since 1943. So about 3.1 feet of it between 1943 and 1996, and the rest after 1996. Now, if you look at the groundwater levels, from the Evangeline, Chico, the Jasper, notice how in tandem they are with the subsidence. This is not unique to this area. You see this all over Houston. Almost every long-term groundwater level and benchmark comparison you do doing this, you see almost the exact same thing. So this is not isolated just here. Now, if you look at where the compaction is occurring inside the aquifer units, based on the modeling that USGS has done, about 0.2 feet of that, or a very small amount of it, has come from the Jasper aquifer, whereas most of it has come from the Evangeline aquifer, which is the primary aquifer in this area that people draw water from. It does not mean wells are not screened in the Chico or the Jasper, it just means there's very few of them, though the overall rate is very low. In the Jasper in this area, you've only got about 12 or 13 wells that pull from the Jasper. All the rest of the Evangeline or Chico. So the reason you only get such a small amount of subsidence from the Jasper, from that most deeply buried unit, is because it's already partially compacted. If you think about that, the farther you go down in Earth's surface, the more basically pushed together the material is because of the weight of the sediment overlying it. So it's already partially compacted, so you're going to get less subsidence per 100 foot of groundwater level decline. Generally, we've noticed in this area, after about 1,700 feet below land surface, you don't generally see much subsidence at all, and that's because, again, it's already compacted, pre-compacted, because it's been so deeply buried for so long. So that's why you don't see much Jasper aquifer subsidence in this area, because the top of it is at about, converted to feet below ground surface, about 1,800 feet below ground surface. So it's very deeply buried. Okay, I'll take you to a second benchmark. This is just south of, it's about 6.5 miles north of the benchmark I just showed you. And it's right at the intersection of Highway 99 and I-45, and it still exists. It's there today. So there's been about 4 feet of subsidence right there just near the county line. Okay. So again, the subsidence is shown the same way with the dashed line, the interpolation between the leveling points, which are each of the solid circles. So this one's also been re-leveled a number of times. If you look at the water level trend, it's almost the same as you saw before. That water level trend very largely matches the subsidence trend. They're very much in tandem. If you look at the amount of compaction coming out of the Jasper as a percentage of the total subsidence at land surface, now you're up to about half a foot. So about 16% of that subsidence is coming from the Jasper. As you move farther and farther up dip, you're seeing a trend, and that trend, as you go up into Montgomery County, holds true. As each of these units outcrop at land surface, more water is used out of the aquifer below it, and then as you move up dip northward, essentially a greater percentage of the water comes out of that lower aquifer unit, and you end up with more compaction. Also because it's closer to land surface. Okay, in closing, just wanted to do two or three other quick slides on this. So at the end of the day, you might ask, why do we care? What does subsidence actually do, to this area? What are the impacts? And there are a few of them. So the first one is flooding risk. I showed you Brownwood. You can see what happens if your neighborhood is at the edge of the sea and you end up with subsidence. Obviously, a very bad result. Up here, we don't have to worry about that because this area is generally... All right, so pick where I was here a second ago. So obviously this area is not Brownwood. You are not right next to the sea. Most of this area, the elevation is about 100 to 200 feet above sea level. So this area is not going to subside into the sea. There's not any risk of neighborhoods, anywhere close to land surface, but there are many streams in this area. This map shows you the hydrography of this area, the detailed version. You see there is a stream almost everywhere leading to and from many of these neighborhoods in this area. So if you have subsidence of 1 foot, that means you are now 1 foot closer in your base level elevation to that water feature. Okay, so you're not near the sea, but you are probably near a body of water, typically a stream. And because that river stage is now a foot higher than it was before, or 2 feet, or in this case, 4 feet, it adds up. That flow in that channel can then be altered and new channels now get created. So 1 foot, maybe you have an issue, maybe not so much. Right now you're looking at between 3 and 5 feet for almost this entire area. So it's just something to think about with the subsidence. Again, you're not near you're not near sea level, but you have many streams and bodies of waters that you are near. And I'll also note that Mike may mention this. The Harris-Galveston Subsidence District is doing a Spring Creek subsidence study, the watershed study, and that will kind of take another look at this area, look at the hydrography, and look at the subsidence and the impacts. Okay, the second thing is decreased well yields. So this does have an impact for all of the districts and for the utilities. Remember how I mentioned earlier that when you have that subsidence happen, those silt and clay layers, then essentially you lose that porosity because they get squished. You lose yield in your wells. Okay, this does happen. So that means you have to pump more water, you have to install more wells. So there is a material cost to all of this. And I would also note that whenever your groundwater levels decline, even without subsidence, eventually if they decline enough, because you're seeing 300-400 feet below land surface all around this area, you do eventually have to reset the pumps, you have to drill deeper wells, so there is a cost to all of this. It's not just science and information that's good to know. There is a cost to this. Okay, so just 2 takeaways. I have this and one last slide. I promise I'll be done here in just a second. So the big takeaways are subsidence continues in this area. It has happened all across the greater Houston area. This area it is still ongoing. And what goes down does not always come up. Most of the subsidence has been permanent. And the subsidence impacts susceptibility to flooding, reduced well yields, and you have associated costs with all of that. So as a final slide, if you're interested to know where you get all this information or where I'm talking about all this from, I attached a QR code. I didn't realize you could do this until yesterday. It's a really neat thing. You can scan that and it will actually take you to the report. It will not mail you a copy of the report, but you can at least look at it online. And if you want to mail a copy, then let me know and I will try to get you a copy when it's printed. So with that said, I hope I didn't run over time and I hope this was informative for everybody.
I wanted to remind everyone there's some snacks over here and some drinks. Just please help yourself. We don't want you to get hangry. You might have cut into your dinner time. Y'all might have seen John Ellis's article in the Community Impact. You can certainly go to the Community Impact in 4 or 5 different regions, and it's still online if you want to read the report. It's very interesting. Thank you very much, John. Very good. We appreciate you being here. Our next speaker, Mike Turco, serves as the general manager of the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District, as well as the Fort Bend Subsidence District, which is administered by the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District staff through an interlocal agreement. As general manager, he is the chief administrative officer responsible for the management of district operations and for developing goals, strategies, and policies necessary to implement the district's legislative mandate. Mr. Turco leads a customer-focused team supporting the district's mission of reasonable groundwater regulation to protect lives and property in Harris, Galveston, and Fort Bend counties from the hazards associated with land subsidence. Mr. Turco holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in geology from the University of Nebraska at Omaha and a Master's of Science in geology and hydrology focused from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Mr. Turco participates in the Region H Planning Group, Groundwater Management Area 14, the Texas Water Conservation Association, and the Texas Association of Groundwater Districts, and internal symposia of land subsidence. Please welcome Mr. Mike Turco.
Thank you all for being here tonight. It's always a pleasure to come talk to you and see you all again. John talked a lot about a lot of the data that stands behind some of the work that we do, and I have a few of those slides also in my presentation. I'll probably skip over those. I may add a few things for you, John, just a couple things, but other than that, appreciate the being able to mesh these two presentations together. We've already talked a little bit about subsidence, and the one thing I wanted to mention about this is that there are a couple pieces to how compaction works in our system, and there's two really big components. There's an elastic component and an inelastic component. And you think elastic, you think rubber band, and that's that part really near the surface. That's tied almost entirely to climatic changes. It's that shrink swell of the clays that crack our driveways and sidewalks and our foundations, and the groundwater withdrawal that we see that causes compaction deeper. That's not really associated with that. It's this deeper compaction, the inelastic kind, is the kind that we're most concerned about, because once that compaction occurs, there's no amount of energy you can put back in the system to undo it. That subsidence happens, and that land surface elevation is gone forever. So that's why it's so incredibly important for us to deal with these issues, and not let them get to the point where, like we saw in Brownwood or Texas City or in the Ship Channel, when they get out of control and you really have dramatic infrastructure issues. Well, John showed a lot of the pictures that I have here about infrastructure damage. I'm not going to get into that more than that. If you have any questions, let me know. But obviously, you can have your wells can be damaged. You can exasperate flooding. I know in our area, historically, we had a large regional areas of subsidence occur, but now, as you'll see a little bit later on, most of our subsidence is occurring perpendicular to our drainage basins, and it's in an isolated area. So that's a little bit different than what we've seen historically. That's an important consideration. And then, of course, Brownwood and John did a great thing in that Gulf 2023 model. If you're interested in Brownwood, that's enough reason to go look at that report, that Gulf 2023 report, because John put in a really large section on the history of Brownwood in there, and it's really detailed. There's a lot of really interesting history there, and John talked a little bit about water level decline in the area over the last 100 years or so, and I had a gentleman named Bob Gabrish who actually did a lot of the initial research and science about compaction and subsidence in our area. He was talking to me when I was working at the USGS back in the day, and he mentioned to me, he goes, we were talking about water level decline over time. He says, you know why spring got their name, right? This is where there were springs here. Way back when, so that's true that there were springs in this area, and the development of groundwater has been our primary source of water here for many years, and it's behind the development and all the industry that came to the Houston area, and been an important source for water for us moving forward. And now as we transition, because of the work of the Subsidence District, to prevent subsidence, we have to transition from that groundwater source to an alternative source. And as many of you know, we were created in 1975 by the legislature to do that, prevent subsidence in Harris and Galveston County. And the only tool that the legislature gave us to do that was the regulation of groundwater, because the body of work and the body of research and the science available, even back then, let us know that overdrafting of the groundwater resources and utilizing groundwater as our primary resource leads to subsidence and cause problems to us on the land surface. So we do that. We have a strong regulatory program that many of you are aware of, but we base that on science and research. We've done that since we were incepted, and we continue to do that today, and I'll talk a lot about that later on. But we also have a water conservation program that I'll also talk about. And as we move forward in Harris County, beyond 2025 and 2035, we have more people coming here every day. People want to live in this area because it's a great place to raise your family, start your business, and have your business. They're all going to need water. And our water resources, we're going to have to learn to be more efficient with those moving forward. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So how do we reduce our reliance on groundwater and prevent subsidence? We reduce groundwater use. And with our regulatory plan, it kind of focuses on reducing our groundwater use and developing alternative sources of water. So you heard Kelly talk a little bit earlier today about some of the projects going on for the north. That's a multi-agency, multi-authority project that has a lot of different folks working together to build these resources in the area. Our regulation is designed to prevent subsidence over a long term through incremental changes in our water use patterns. And our studies have completed by research programs like the University of Houston, by the U.S. Geological Survey, by the National Geodetic Survey, and others to help us develop our regulatory plan and make sure that it's appropriate and that it'll actually solve the problem that we're trying to solve, but also attainable and able to be accomplished in the amount of time that we have out there. And we do this, it's kind of an interesting way that we've gone about this. We've created a regulatory plan. We monitor the results of that regulatory plan. We do some research to better understand the system and better understand the impacts of water use on the aquifer system and that response of the aquifer system on compaction and that land surface that we see at the surface. And take all that information and then look at our regulatory plan again and make sure that we're appropriate in getting the job done on a regulatory plan without going too far down the road and going farther than we have to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the way we develop our science and research and talk about our regulatory plan. As we evaluate our framework this year, we actually started in 2020-ish, 2019, the USGS started with their model update. In 2020, we began our joint regulatory plan review. And we brought in, we've had multiple stakeholder meetings, and I know some of you have been able to attend, and talking about the population projections that have come out of our regulatory plan review and the modeling and other things. We've actually completed some projects looking at the availability of alternative water sources, and that information is available on our website as well. And right now we're in the middle of developing population projections and water demand, per capita water demand, and that's just about wrapped up. As a matter of fact, we've presented that information to Region H as part of their analysis, part of the Region H state water planning, and then working through that process are looking at and reviewing our regulatory plan moving forward. So when I talk about science-based, John talked a lot about some of the work that the USGS has done, and the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District has worked with the USGS since we were created in 1975. So that data that we collect every year, it's really good information in that year, but really the best way for us to use that is to build that into our planning process. So as you guys are collecting your data at your MUD districts and looking at the value of that from year to year, recognize that the data that you collect today is really for several years down the road so that you can compare where you're at to where you were and gauge your successes that way. We document all of our monitoring and data collection in the district in our annual groundwater report. We just recently held a public hearing on that last Thursday. The board will consider that and in their regular board meeting next Wednesday. But that annual groundwater report includes information on that you all provide, that your MUD districts all provided us on your water use. It also includes information from the USGS on their water level measurements, and it includes information that we've collected through our partners at the University of Houston on subsidence throughout the area, through our GPS network. And all that information is compiled into a report. So if you're interested in that, that's available up on our website. You can hit the QR code to go take a look at it. And we have a lot of different research projects going on at different times. John mentioned the Spring Creek Watershed Project. What that one has done is used the latest MapNext models for Spring Creek and ran and utilized a subsidence scenario inside of that compared a lower amount of subsidence to more subsidence in the area based on some historical data, and looked at the impact of that on flood inundation and cost and the economic cost associated with that. So that project, we expect to be able to release that information later on this year. Right now, the MapNext model is in FEMA review, and once that's completed later on this year, we'll release that. And then we'll move to probably a basin to the south. And I know that we've talked internally about moving to the Cypress Creek Basin to do the same study. So there's this ability to be able to use this latest technology and latest models to help us understand the impact of some of these things is really good, and we look forward to moving that project to another basin here, beginning hopefully later on this year. Other things that we've done, we've recently worked and gathered all the available geophysical logs and borehole logs, information that tells us that drillers collect when they drill wells in the area. We've compiled all that information and pulled it together to get an improved understanding of the hydrogeology and the lithology of the area. So the makeup and the orientation and juxtaposition of all of these different silts and clays and sands. We published that several years ago. It was incorporated into the model that John Ellis and the USGS folks were able to develop. And it was a really big step forward in our understanding of the occurrence of different types of clays and silts in the area. This is just one step. This is something that the district has been doing for years and years, but this was the latest update to that. And I included here just one map from inside of there. It's the total clay thickness in the Evangeline Aquifer, and you can see up in this area, the total clay thickness for all the clays in the Evangeline in that area is somewhere in the order of 500 feet or so. So that's the kind of information that we can get out of that could be incorporated inside of the model, and that's important because, as John said, it's that clay and silt that we're most concerned with. That's the part of the aquifer system that compacts, and when you have more clay, you have more opportunity for compaction, and that's an important consideration when you're looking at where subsidence may occur in the future. We've also utilized satellite technology. The map on your right shows just one example from our latest INSTAR work in cooperation with the Southern Methodist University and Dr. Liu up there. They're working with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California and others in the USGS and NASA to develop techniques to utilize this type of methodology in our area. INSTAR stands for Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar, and all that really means is that they have the satellite going around, it shoots a radar beam down, and comes back around the same place, same time. 14 days later, does it again, and they compare them. And they can, by doing that, they're not getting elevation, they're not measuring elevation, they're measuring change in the movement of the Earth away and towards the satellite. And over time, they can get millimeter accuracy on that, and that helps us because, as you'll see later on, we have a static network of GPS sites out there that are measuring subsidence every day. There's about 200 or so of them throughout the region. But it helps us look in between those points as the very basic, a reconnaissance tool for us to know where to go back in and set some of these permanent sites in the future. The district collects an awful lot of data with our partners. You've seen some of it with John and the aquifer data. Water levels, we do a lot of lithology mapping, or we have in the past. We have the extensometers in the area. There's always the opportunity to put another extensometer in, but as John mentioned, they're very expensive. And we feel like we have a pretty good handle on what parts of the system compact. But we may look at doing another extensometer in the future. Water use data, both groundwater pumpage and alternative water usage is important for us to understand. As part of all of your permits, you are required to use a portion of your total water demand as an alternative water supply. And if you're working inside of the GRP of the North Harris County Regional Water Authority, they're keeping track of all that between all the different mud districts, and they're making sure that they're compliant with us because they are a permittee of the district. But that alternative water usage is important, and understanding where that alternative water use is coming from and where it's being utilized is a big part of our regulatory plan. And then on the subsidence data, we do the GPS work, we do the INSAR work. One thing John mentioned was the benchmark re-leveling and surveying. That's something that, John's right, that's expensive. I mean, John mentioned that back in the day they went from Galveston Pier north into this area, but once they figured out that the Galveston was subsiding and they had a land movement there, they started bringing those levels all the way in from Bastrop. So they would put an instrument on a benchmark in Bastrop and work that elevation all the way into the area. Very expensive work to do. So we hadn't done that in a while. The last survey we had done was in 2000, and we did a small survey in 2010. But just this last year, we worked with the National Geodetic Survey and the Conrad Blucher Institute at Texas A&M Corpus Christi to re-level several 120 or so of our benchmarks that we've had out there over the years. So that data, I'd hope to have it to show you a figure for today, but NGS is still reviewing finalizing that data, but that data will be released here later on this spring, and it will give us more information on the historical perspective at some of these benchmarks and how much subsidence has occurred. This NGS benchmark releveling is a really interesting project in that it not only benefits the district in better understanding what the magnitude of subsidence historically has been, but it also helps out the engineering and the surveying community in that just prior to this survey, the National Geodetic Survey had basically invalidated every benchmark in the area except for the benchmarks that are 14 extensometers because they were moving. So the ability for us to go back there and provide that information for us, but then have a service for the surveying community is really great. So we're happy to get that project done and out the door here later on this spring. Looking at our subsidence monitoring network, here's a map that shows all the locations of our network. There's different colors, different shapes, because we have different agencies cooperating with us. We work with the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District, Brazoria County Groundwater Conservation District, the TxDOT, and University of Houston, among others, to develop this network. And like John said, we have a core network inside of the greater Houston area, and then a larger network that's distal to that, that's in areas that we can show are stable. And then we use that bigger network to develop a reference frame in the area and then monitor subsidence following methodology developed by the University of Houston. So when using that data, and John showed this map a little earlier, his map had a lot more lines, mine's colorful. From a guy who's colorblind, I mean, luckily it's just like one shade of one color. But basically the darker colors are areas where we have higher amounts of subsidence. The lighter colors are areas where we have lesser amount of subsidence. This is the same interval from 1906 to 2000, actually. And the bottom line here is that subsidence began down where industry and where most of the work was being done in Houston. Back in the back in the 30s, 40s, World War II, there was a big influx of people coming in and a lot of industry work down there. So our largest numbers that we see are down near the coast along the ship channel. And as John mentioned, as people moved into the area and began to move up the I-45 corridor, out 290, out I-10, we began to see the water levels decline in the aquifer. And then we began to see subsidence occur in those areas, and that's why you see that migration to the north and to the west. Just so you know, that darker area in and around the Jersey Village area, that corner of Beltway 8, that's a broad area of about 7 feet of subsidence over that interval of time. If you look at our GPS data, and these are at one point in space, so these are areas where they're just like one area they're not like the contours you saw a minute ago. The darker, the warmer the color, the higher the rate. The lighter the color, the smaller the number, the lower the rate. And what you can see here, and this is really important, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, we have 3 regulatory areas. We didn't always have 3. At one point we had 8. But we have 3 regulatory areas now. And in areas 1 and 2, they have gone through the full conversion process. So in area 1, right now they're at 10% groundwater and 90% alternative water. In area 2, they're at 20% groundwater and 80% alternative water. Area 3, if you're not in a GRP right now, which I'm assuming that all of you are in a GRP, but if you're not, you're currently at 20% groundwater. But if you're in a GRP, you're at 70% groundwater, right? And you're moving your way to 20% at 2035. So most of the conversion, most of the impacts of the reduction in groundwater has been seen in areas 1 and 2. And what you see from this map tells you the same story. Those small little green circles are areas where the subsidence rate is less than 5 millimeters per year. There may even be some areas there where there's a little bit of uplift, part of that elastic part of the surface. But in area 3, where there's groundwater is still the primary source of water, and the vast majority of water users there are at 70%, that's where we're still seeing the subsidence rates that are 1 centimeter, 1.5 centimeters, even out in Katy above 2 centimeters per year. That's about a half a foot to a foot per decade, if you want to put it in those kind of numbers. So last year, if you looked at this map, some of the rates were a little bit lower. This past year, with the drought and the increased water use, we've seen the rates accelerate. And we expect to see that continue, assuming that the climate doesn't revert back to where we were before, which is basically a wet period in the area. So really important data for us. It helps tell us, the success story that we've had in area 1 and 2, and the direction that we have to go in area 3. So that's good information for us that we collect every year and publish in our annual groundwater report. I talked a little bit about our regulatory plan evolving over time, and it has. In 1975, we started with an area of concentrated emphasis that basically included the coastal areas and the ship channel. And in that area, we said in 75, you need to convert from groundwater as fast as possible. And they did, but they had an advantage there because they had infrastructure in place. They had canals in place. They were already getting about 50% of their water from alternative supply. Most of it was industrial, so it was raw water primarily. So they were able to move that off of groundwater fairly quickly. over time, we went through several different iterations. Those iterations of different regulatory arrangements and number of areas was really based on development and when we thought we could get alternative water to those areas, but it got really complex. And in 1985, we were up to 8 different regulatory areas with different conversion amounts and different timing. And you can look at that and say that would be a difficult thing to attain with all those different areas trying to convert at a different time. So in 1999, in talking with folks in the community, we settled on 3 regulatory areas, and that's where we stay today. Regulatory areas 1, 2, and 3. I talked about the conversion requirements, but I'll just say them again. In 2010, and like Kelly mentioned, in 2010 and 2013 regulatory plan, we actually moved our dates from where they are now, from where they were in 2010 to where they are now. And that is in Area 3, their requirement to be at 70% by 2010. We were already there. And then we go to 40% groundwater in 2025 and then 20% in 2035. So we've made that move in 2013 based on that regulatory plan review. We're in the midst of a regulatory plan review right now, like I mentioned before. We've gone through the population projections and demand projections, and we're moving on to running regulatory scenarios. As a matter of fact, right now we're running the baseline scenario, which takes the Gulf 2023 model, the new population projections of per capita water demand, and runs that through the model to evaluate our current regulatory plan as it's today. And then as we get that information back from that, we'll be able to evaluate other possible scenarios related to other parts of our regulatory plan, and look at the future that way. But that's the process, and we're in the middle of that. We'll have stakeholder meetings later on in the spring and probably early summer, talking about some of these initial results. And then, as we mentioned before, the district has consistently worked with our stakeholders, worked with our permitting community to help develop our regulatory plan to assure it's attainable and reasonable, but ultimately solves the problem. We've collaborated with water authorities like the North and the West and the Central Water Authorities, the City of Houston, other cities in the area, neighboring groundwater conservation districts, other permittees, municipalities in the area, and even elected officials, not only within our region, but statewide. We did talk a little bit about the infrastructure and alternative infrastructure in our area. I'm not going to get too far into that, other than to say that there have been some delays in the process, but water's about to be delivered, and from what we've been told, water's about to get to where it needs to be, and that's great. There's been a lot of effort and a lot of work done by the authorities and the cities to get this done, and the district certainly recognizes that and the hard work being done to facilitate that development of those alternative structures, alternative infrastructure. So the last thing I wanted to mention, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, is water conservation. I know water conservation sometimes is tough because water conservation can be counter to revenue, and revenue is important to keep water moving through the pipe and all that. But as we move forward and are utilizing these alternative source waters as a bigger percentage of our total water demand, water conservation becomes more and more important. And I know, just talking about myself, I mean, I'll be honest with you, before I got into this position 10 years ago, I didn't watch how much water I was putting on my lawn very closely. And until I got educated on how much water I was using to keep my grass green and my flowers happy, and understanding that it was way more than I needed to, I wasn't doing a good job. But now I am, because I got some good information to look at. So Water My Yard and the Smarter About Water website gives you that information. And it's something that you can share with your water users. It's available. Smarter About Water website was something that was designed to be a resource for everybody. So feel free to use it. If you got something that you want to put on there that you think is neat, let us know. We'll work with you on that. And then the Water My Yard program is a free service that's available to anybody in Harris County. And you have the ability to go in there, put in a little bit of information about your home irrigation system, and it'll tell you, based on recent climate data that are collected at our weather stations and Harris County Flood Control's rainfall data, how much you should water your lawn. And then if you like it, you can put in your email address. It'll email you every Monday or Tuesday on how to set your water system. So it's free, costs nothing to do, and it's something that we'd really like to see more participation in, because we know that 40% of our total water demand at our homes, if we have a lawn and irrigation system, is done outside. A lot of water used outside. So if you can get on that, watermyyard.org, it'd be a great thing. I think if you hit that QR code, you can get to our Smarter About Water page, and then you can go look at that. We have had a grant program that we've been building over the last few years. It's supported the development or the installation of irrigation controls for a couple school districts in the area. We worked with City of League City to use satellite technology to find leaks, and that was really successful. They were able to identify leaks and fix those through using INSAR, similar to what we were doing for Subsidence. And then here recently, we've worked with some folks to put in automated metering to evaluate whether or not that can help with water conservation in the future. So with that, I'll be happy to turn it back to Jerry. Thank you.
Well, that was a lot of information. We're fixing to get into the question and answer part of our program. A couple of comments on, I know Timber Lane and Postwood and several districts are big on Water Smart. You can go through AWBD and join that organization. Per capita and how much a person uses each day of water is a big factor moving forward with water supplies and so on. For me personally, I had a camper and I had to tote the waste every day for a while when we would go camping. And that really registered on water conservation. You really started turning it off and paying close attention when you had to haul it off by hand. I get around, but conservation is something, it's a double-edged sword, right? We want to sell water, yet we want to conserve as well. There's nothing like conserving when you have a regional water authority fee that's $4.10 or whatever that number may be. You tend to conserve when your pocketbook gets hit as well. These automated meters that are coming out, they're great. You can set, we'll have a customer come in and they swear up and down they didn't use that water. But you flip that computer screen around and you say at 5:05 p.m. this leak started. And the good news is, and we can show that chart, but we can put alerts in if we see someone who's using water that they normally wouldn't be using, and we can contact that customer to let them know that there's a problem. So it really is a good tool. And eventually everybody will go to the automated meters, I'm sure. If you hadn't already, it's expensive, but sooner or later you will make that change. We do have a mic set up over here for questions and answers. So I know a lot of you probably have some questions, so if you can please start lining up there. We're going to try to maybe give you one or a follow-up if you have a follow-up question. We want to get into some interaction, some good discussion about some of the issues that we're all facing. Okay, Mr. Rendell?
I guess this is on. I really do appreciate everything that I've heard today from John and from Mike. It's things that I used to say every time I went out and made a presentation to the folks when I was on the Regional Water Authority. But there are some things that have concerned me. Last Monday night, for instance, at the NHCRWA meeting, I heard a person from Montgomery County come up and talk about a project that his organization is undertaking. The project sounded very much like they were trying to determine how much subsidence there would occur if they started drawing more water out of the Jasper aquifer. It sounded to me like they were saying, hey, we can go to the Jasper aquifer, there's not going to be any subsidence as a result of Jasper, so why do we have to convert to surface water? Anybody care to comment on that?
Mike and John, would y'all mind standing at the podium and we can just kind of, either one of us answer the question?
Yeah, so I do believe that Lone Star is working on a project to develop some extensometers and collect some coring data from the Jasper up in Montgomery County, because there has been some question, at least in that organization, about the susceptibility of the Jasper to compaction. I think some of the data that John's pulled together as part of the Gulf 2023 model shows that the Jasper is compactable. I think there's been other research, though, it's been out there. University of Houston's done work on this recently and published a peer-reviewed article about the Jasper and its compaction. There's been work done by SMU as well in the same regard in peer-reviewed journal articles that talk about the Jasper compaction. And down in Harris County with the Jasper, John's right. The impact on the Jasper has been a little bit small, but the issue with that is that no one's using the Jasper in Harris County. We haven't had a whole lot of stress on the Jasper aquifer here because the water quality has issues the further south you get in the system. So the Jasper is compactable. It's there, like I tell folks, like there is no free lunch in our aquifer system. There's just not. Some people want there to be, but there's not.
Can we talk a little bit about the Jasper water quality and the difficulty to get it? Because we went to submersible pumps about 15, 20 years ago when we were having issues with the water table dropping. And we got to the point where the insurance companies wouldn't insure us anymore. Because after 3 or 4 years, the submersible pumps were going out and we were having problems. Also with the Jasper, especially down south, the water, the alkalinity, the salt that's related to it, you require an RO system in a lot of cases, reverse osmosis to deal with that. You have to have high voltage, 2300 volt in your system because you got a submersible that's going down that deep to pull the water up versus a vertical turbine that you might have in a shallower well. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah,
else
I'll
to
just
that?
say that the Fort Bend Subsidence District has worked with Cinco Mud #1 over there to evaluate the Jasper in their area. But they're down 3,200 feet or so, very deep, and they are doing RO. It's a brackish project. Yeah. And the district wanted to take a look at that for no other reason than to just get more information about the Jasper in Fort Bend County, because no one has put a hole in the Jasper in Fort Bend County ever. But that's an RO system. You're right. It's old water. John mentioned the age of that water, tens of thousands of years old. That's old water, and it's been there for a while and has had a chance to pick up a lot of things in the aquifer along the way. The further south you get in the system, the water quality can change dramatically.
Good. Al, do you have another
Yeah,
one?
Jerry, I had one other one. I appreciated the recap of the articles that have been in the community impact news, and they've been some really, really good ones. Unfortunately, some of the board members of the new North Harris County Regional Water Authority don't seem to believe or even read some of those things because they are still telling us there is no subsidence in the area, therefore we don't have to convert any longer, and therefore, we can stop and hold back. What can we do to help educate those folks as well as all folks about subsidence in our area? Thank you.
Well, this meeting that we're having today is a start in the right direction. For me, I think we're all trying to do the same thing, just maybe some different ideas on how to get there. And can we afford, let's just take the 10 years, for example. Can we afford to sink another 6 inches to a foot? You might save some money right now with your water bill, and I'm all for that. Everybody wants to save as much money. But what happens when your house is now in the floodplain? Did you save any money? David?
I'm David Barker. I happen to be one of the board members of the North Harris County Water.
Thank you for joining us, David. Glad you're here.
So I have a couple questions. One is, both for John. What is your? You mentioned that the subsidence in the Jasper will be much less than subsidence anywhere else because it's much deeper.
Correct.
So that is a fact.
Correct.
The other thing that I believe is a fact is that everything that widely accepted extensiometers measures only the surface, so it's a combination of everything. So when things dry out around here, or when you put concrete on everything, or when you build giant road systems that vibrate the surface, all of that causes compaction at the surface. It may not be in the aquifer. I don't doubt that there is some in the aquifer, but it seems like there's answers that won't cost $3 billion.
Right.
That's my statement.
So I would just
Hey,
note
Dave,
that,
hey, David, you wanna wait? You might have some interaction there. Let's have a discussion.
thought I was getting off the hook for a second. So I would say that typically, scientifically, when you look at aquifer system compaction, the only way in scientific literature they validate it is through an extensometer.
Yep.
Now you realize that, I mean, as the Jasper gets closer to land surface, when you get up into, say, Montgomery County, it's at the same level as the Evangeline is underneath the Earth's surface. It's
Okay.
here in this area, and the sediment is very similar.
Okay.
So you essentially have down here, obviously, as I mentioned, the Jasper, you're going to get very little compaction relatively because it's so deeply buried. But as you move up dip, it's less and less buried. And the property is very similar. To answer your question, are there other technologies? Possibly, but in the literature, they typically use extensometers to verify it because of how accurate and how precise the answer is. Because you need to have something into the multiple zeros to take a look at that in some of these areas where you don't have a ton of compaction happening all at one time. This isn't Baytown and Brownwood where you had almost half a foot happening every
Right.
year.
Yeah, so I guess the point of the water authority as of now is that we don't live on the coast. We're nowhere near the coast. We're not even really in the same aquifer system as the coast. Most of our water, at least out where I live, most of the water comes out of the surface aquifer. So I'm in the very northwest part of Harris County. So most people out there are drawing out of 300-foot wells or less, 200-foot wells. Hasn't been any big problems with people's wells driving up. I've been living out there for 20-some years, and we've had one well had to be lowered in 2012, whatever it was, when we had that really bad drought. So I question I know that the capability to get to the Jasper is very simple. And the pumps that can get there, the oil industry's been using them for 100 years. So the ability to get the water out of the Jasper is available. And it would be a lot cheaper than moving water from all over the place to here. That's my point.
Let me address some of that. So we've got a partnership with the city of Houston, and we've got a 400 million gallon per day facility that's 95% complete.
Yeah, but we should finish it.
So, and we got a Lucid Bayou project, an interbasin transfer of water coming from the Trinity, 2 water basins, the San Jacinto and the Trinity. That will sustain us with water for the next 50 years. Thank you, David. Appreciate the question. Mr. Pat?
I thank you, gentlemen, for putting this together, for doing what you have done and what you continue to do, because you're answering a need that we may not see, but my child, my grandchild will see it. That's what we're trying to take care of. I found out that FEMA is going to have a pretty good size change in their flood maps. We didn't understand the cost associated with the floods. Anyhow, thank you again. One other comment I'd just like to make. You had a recent current director from the Regional Water Authority, Harris County Regional Water Authority. You allowed, this forum allowed him to have an interchange. I think that getting into the Jasper is going to cause a lot of issues, as everyone well knows who's been in the water district business. I've been in it 38 years. I've seen problems up in Montgomery County that are still trying to be addressed. But the point is that you gave him a forum. We don't get a forum when we go to the Regional Water Authority. We get 3 minutes. We don't get any dialogue. We have to listen to what they're saying, the information that they're saying, that we do not believe in. We don't get facts, we get fictions. You guys have provided us with a lot of facts. And for all the people that are here, you need to come to the monthly meetings for the Regional Water Authority and hear what is actually taking place there. Because it's not facts, it's fictions. Thank you very much.
Bill, I will say that the North Harris County Regional Water Authority does give the 3 minutes, and you get an opportunity to speak. Most board members' meetings don't allow interaction and so forth, but glad to provide this forum. That's what AWBD does. And I like the exchange here, and so I'm glad to be able to have this discussion and be able to interact. So, and I do agree, people should go to the meetings or listen in. You need to be informed. Norm, thank you, sir.
Thank you. So my name is Norman Adamic. I'm with Mud 249. We have a well just 2 miles from here that's just south of Old Town Spring. It's been at the same level for over 20 years. But really technical points. I think my first one is for John. I believe I read a paper that was published by your organization that kind of seemed to indicate that perhaps the Chicote and the Evangeline aquifers, due to shifting sands and the like, could almost be considered one at this point. Are you familiar with that paper, and can you comment on it, please?
I can. I was on that. So about 2 years ago, due to the relook that Mike Turco mentioned about looking at the aquifer base, the thickness, and all that that happened as a part of this Gulf 2023 project. When you looked at how things were redone with the stratigraphy, essentially we realized the Chico is a bit thicker than we classified it as before. The Evangeline's a little bit thinner. So when we actually did that reclassification, then we intersected all those well screens to this new classification. We had a whole lot of wells that now became Chico for the Evangeline, which means now we were missing a lot of our network. So we said, okay, we know that for years you can see the hydrologic response in nearby wells in the Chico and the Evangeline. You see this all over the place. For the purposes of creating water level maps, specifically that purpose, we are going to combine the two into one map. We are not necessarily saying that they are entirely coupled, and we're not saying they're entirely just one single aquifer unit, but for the purpose of water level monitoring, we see them as well.
All right, thank you. Mike, I have a question for you, please. From my reading, with most of the studies going all the way back to many years ago, it seems like the primary recharge zones of the aquifers that North Harris County relies on is up in North Montgomery County or somewhere in that area. Can you, with the HGSD, work to address the preservation of those areas? Is that something you've considered? Can you address it?
Well, I think it's a good point. It's something that we can certainly work with the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District, are the one that's in charge of Montgomery County. The Evangeline outcrop area kind of exists up there in northern Montgomery County. They're, if I remember right by Lake Conroe, or just a little bit north of there. So yeah, we can work with them on that. I think that's an important part of what we have going on here. Because like John said, we do get a lot of rainfall here, and most of that hits the Chico, and a vast majority of that ends up in our surface drainages like we see when it rains. So the one thing to consider, and it's really important, is that the water moves the system very slow. So when we say the water is very old, it's very old here, we can say that because we've used isotopes to look at their age. And in some cases, we have to go all the way to chlorine isotopes, which is like the last one you use, because it can be so old. But I say that to say this, is that we don't see any anthropogenic or human type things down there. So we're not seeing that water that hits the surface get way down there. It's even though it hit the surface over there, it still hasn't gotten to our point way over here. So protecting that recharge area is important, but we probably need better, but also well served looking here and conserving what we do here as well. But that's a good point. We'll talk to them about that and be engaged on that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, dear friends, I would never be politically shrill, but I attend the North Harris County Regional Water Authority meetings myself, and the so-called new board has not canceled any projects up to this point, and they haven't talked about it. Thank you.
Doug Caldwell, Harris County, Mud 1. with what we're doing, is subsidence gonna be halted or reversed, or will we continue to have subsidence?
Yeah, so it's not gonna be reversed, but the intent of the regulatory plan is to bring those rates down well below 5 millimeters per year, which is inside of that measurement error that we have with our system. So, our intent is to bring subsidence down to that very low level like we've seen elsewhere in the district. And that's what the regulatory plan scenario we've seen in those scenarios in the recent plan and the one in 2010, 2013, that's what they showed.
And isn't the subsidence in Cypress caused by the city of Houston taking all the water out of it? I mean, aren't they taking a ridiculous amount of water out of that area from the
Well,
city?
I mean, I think the city of Houston has a large well field there. There are a lot of well fields in the Cypress Creek Basin.
Right.
And they all contribute to the water level decline that we see there. But our regulatory plan our regulatory plan, our regulations apply equally to everybody. So nobody gets a free lunch on that either.
Okay.
I'd like to go back to, Norm, to your comment. Although nothing has, actually stopped from the North Harris County Regional Water Authority, efforts like a 10-year setback that you've seen in the letter that was sent to the Subsidence District from 2025 to 2035 and from 2035 to 2045, or hesitation on borrowing money from the Texas Water Development Board over the next 5 years to move forward with the 2025 completion of the distribution system. Things of that sort concern me. We need to move forward and get that money and get converted as quickly as possible. And when you have hesitation and things of that sort, then yeah, I think you should be concerned. And we do need to move along as quickly as we can. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Lester Lee. I'm with MUD 29, Northwest Harris County MUD 29. I just have two concerns, well, one question and one concern. The concern is, I believe that all the systems that North Harris County Regional Water System that's been developed, you guys use the engineering teams from Houston that designed the Houston water system. And just last year, did they lose out? They lost all power or whatever, and everybody in Houston had to go to a water boil. I mean, is that gonna happen with the systems that you guys are putting us on now? I mean, have y'all looked at what happened there and making sure that you're designing your system that's not gonna happen like that?
I'm not here to defend the city of Houston, I can assure you of that.
But you use the same engineers.
Well, I think there's an assortment of engineers. Go ahead, Kelly.
Well, first of all, the authority only owns capacity in that northeast treatment plant. We don't operate it. We didn't design or build it. That was all on the city. So when they decided they were gonna go build this treatment plant, we invested and we bought capacity in that. I'm guessing that they have learned from their mistakes and nobody likes to have boil water notices. So, we don't have any, we have a representative that's out there as they're building the plant, and we have input, but we don't make the decisions.
Let me add to that real quick.
That's kind of disheartening for me.
Let me add to that. So the facilities, they have 3 surface water plants off of Lake Houston. Is that correct, guys? The south,
Not
south.
off of Houston, two off of Lake Livingston, if you will, and only one off of Lake
But
Houston.
the one on Lake Houston is fixing to modernize. That facility is very old, and it's going to be not to say there won't be any problems when they do start it up, because they'll have to get it right. But they're going from an 80 million gallon per day facility to a 400 million gallon per day facility. And much better equipment and things of that sort. So hopefully that will help them be more consistent in providing water to all of us out here receiving it.
Thank you for that. The next was, I know you guys talked about alternative water sources. So the only thing that I've really been seeing is groundwater. So question number one, what is another alternative water supply? Number two, I noticed that there's no desalination, like, programs being started, because if I notice on your map, it looks like down by the coast is where a lot of the subsidence is happening. So if you had desalination plants that's producing some water and backfilling what you have to pull out of the ground, then to me, that would be helping the situation. And then you would get better at creating these desalination plants. And the only thing I could think of, you say it was very expensive, I could see from a power perspective. But as I drive down the coast to Corpus Christi, I see windmill farms all over the place. So to me, that's be another science study to look at. Okay, so for desalination, is it a power issue? If it is, well, guess what? There's plenty of wind blowing. You know, why can't they come up with this? Where's the scientific engineering there? I mean, or have y'all even looked at investing in that?
Lester, I appreciate that whole comment, because we've spent a whole part of our regulatory plan review looking at alternative water sources. And when I say alternative water sources, that's something alternative to just regular old groundwater, right? So treated surface water, we all know about that. But we did look at other methods. We looked at aquifer storage and recovery. We looked at some managed aquifer recharge, and both of those have some challenges in our area. But one thing we did look at was seawater desal. And we identified out of the whole slew of all possible alternative waters, I think 7 or 8 different possible alternatives that could be utilized in the area, and gave a timeline and an expected cost per 1,000 gallons in this report. So I'll talk to you afterwards. I'll give you a link to that so you can go take a look at it. But I do want to mention that seawater desal is the silver bullet for us, right? Because it's an unlimited supply. It doesn't cause subsidence, and it's right where we see a lot of our main water needs are, which are along the coast and the industrial corridor, right? Now, the subsidence that I showed in that map, that was historical. There's not any subsidence going on there right now that we've seen in our INSAR measurements or in our GPS measurements. But you know, we talked about the Trinity River supplying most of the water for this area. Go back to 2011, the Trinity River weathered the 2011 drought really well, right? But the Brazos River did not. And the Brazos River supplies water to Fort Bend County and Galveston County, particularly the industrial corridor. So we see that as an opportunity to try to support and develop seawater desal as, if anything else, a possible way to get their demand off the Brazos River's books, so that other folks upstream have additional water supply to develop for their development. Because that area in Fort Bend County, Waller County, is growing dramatically right now. So we are thinking about that, but it's a great point. And there's, like you said, there's other options out there. Power is a big issue for seawater desal, but we have options for that, and the technology is getting better. But I appreciate that question.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's all I have.
One other point I want to make related to that, and Al will like this, because he's always promoted it. We've got to keep our wells healthy. Regardless if we move to surface water, if you've got a well, you need to make sure you're running it, you're maintaining it, because if something does go wrong with the city of Houston, you can turn on your well and still have water, as long as we still have water in the home. So make sure that you maintain the well that you have.
Good evening, my name is Cindy Youngs. I'm with Prestonwood Forest in Northwest Houston. Lester stole my question, because I wanted to talk about alternative water as well. If we are considering subsidence, I know things are expensive, but in the long run, like, how expensive are we talking about? You know, and where are we with regard to desalination? Because it does seem like it's a very potentially viable opportunity or solution for our needs. Is it in my lifetime, my kid's lifetime? Is it?
I think it's definitely in your lifetime. And I think that seawater desal was cost prohibitive 10 years ago.
Right.
It's not quite as much now than it was then. There's actually a pilot project going in near Corpus Christi right now. So there's some opportunity there. There's some public-private partnerships that have been working this area, trying to develop interest in that seawater, that desalinated seawater for supply. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 to $6 per thousand wholesale.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it could be a potentially goal-saving opportunity for so many issues.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And it's something that we're going to be looking at and trying to find partners to work with us to see if we can incentivize that as an alternative water source in our area for parts of the region.
One thing I wanted to just kind of plug for everybody, I've been on my board for 6 years, so not near as long as everybody here, but you know, everybody talks about the water, the expense, the this, the that, and I tell people, and they, you know, a lot of times people will say, well, I don't care what happens there, I don't care what happens there. And I'm like, well, you have to have some concept, and you have to care what happens there, because there is yours as well. I said, try having a business with no water, try selling a home in a neighborhood with no accessible water. You're nowhere. You become a ghost town. And with floods and whatever, we can't afford not to think of water. And so, you know, I plug that, and then people go, oh, I didn't think about that. Because people are very narrow-minded. They just think, my water, my neighborhood, me. And it is much broader. So I want to plug that, and I want maybe an opportunity for desalination so we can just get water from
Matchups.
I will say that the program that the Regional Water Authority has is very good. And if you're looking to utilize some of your wastewater treatment effluent and you've got a place to use it, their program will help you fund that entire project through credits and things of that sort. So you might want to look into that. Well, we've reached that time, 8 o'clock. Most of you stuck with us, so that's a good sign. We must have done something right. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for attending. We hope you enjoyed the program. Thank you to Kelly Fessler, John Ellis, and Mike Perko, our sponsors, AWD, Water User Coalition, and Timber Lane Utility District. Safe travel. Thank you very much.